All right. Well, welcome to Office Hours. My name is Mark Stepp. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer here at Realvolve. Today, we're going to have some fun. We're going to go over an idea that I've had for some time. And previous to some updates that we've done recently with webhooks, you could do it, but it was rather tough because you had to use what we used to call reverse zaps. And reverse zaps pretty much have been obsoleted. We just really don't need them anymore. But what we're going to talk about today is the idea of using maybe a status board or some kind of spreadsheet information that you normally show on the wall to update your team, to actually do it within a spreadsheet within the system. So bear with me. This actually has multiple uses, and I'm just using this as an example, but definitely it's something that you can use to update through the workflow process, update your system, whatever that is, whether it's a board, whether it's a spreadsheet, whether it's some kind of informational piece, to be able to update your team, update staff, whomever is able to see that board or information. So to actually get this kind of in the mindset, one thing that I'm going to be covering is what we call Webhook. And we've been doing this for the past, 4, 5, 6 weeks, going over webhooks and just using different examples of how you can utilize those webhooks. And it's really important for you to understand that a webhook is real simple. It's just a URL. It's just a web address that you can push data to. That's all it is. So if we look at it in the context of Realvolve, there are 3 main databases within Realvolve. You've got your contacts, your properties, and your transactions. And you can now use a workflow action called our webhook option and send data through the cloud, through the internet, to some URL, some website address. And you can use it for, in this case, what we're going to be going over is updating Google Sheets, but I mean, you can do Slack, Trello, PDFs. We've done several different examples, and you guys can go to our YouTube channel where we have a playlist for our users to kind of listen to all the re-recorded or recorded items that we've done in the past, and just kind of get some ideas of what you can really do to help automate what you do on a daily basis. So the challenge that I wanted to try to really hit on today was maintaining a pipeline board of some sort for your team. And the challenge is that, that can be time consuming. It can be error prone. It can be just kind of a pain in the butt because erasing names and stuff. And a lot of you may not even use the old update boards like this. Some do. But think about it this way. It's not necessarily just a pipeline board. You can use it for virtually any kind of information that you want to display. And so what we want to do is something like this, where maybe you have a monitor up on the wall, and maybe you have, in this case, I'm just kind of using a spreadsheet to display the status board of some properties. What's the status? What side am I representing? The buyer side, the seller side, or whatever. So you can display this up on the board anytime anything updates through a Realvolve workflow that updates the spreadsheet through the webhook. It just magically appears on there and can update. And the key here is making sure that it can update of some sort. So what I intend to do is kind of show you that process of what you would do to use a spreadsheet. And again, this is just an example, but you can use it for virtually anything to update that, get updates through Realvolve. So there's really 4 steps we're going to do. We're going to make a spreadsheet. and that may be the most important part, is just understanding what's on the spreadsheet to keep it simple. We then need to make a webhook within our Zap. We're going to use Zapier for this. We're going to create a webhook, and we're going to build a workflow. And it could just be one activity in the workflow. It could be multiple activities in the workflow that does this process. But in either case, we're going to show that. And then we're going to go through the process of how to make that spreadsheet a little bit prettier so that you can actually display it up on the screen, because you probably don't want to just display the raw data and make it available to everybody, because it just doesn't look good. So we're going to make it look pretty as well. So the first thing that you really, really need to do is identify the fields, identify the information that you're going to want to display. And I'm going to strongly encourage you to think it through. Maybe review some of your own spreadsheet compilations of things that you've done on status boards in the past. Maybe you already have a spreadsheet and you just want to update it. That would work as well in this example. In my purpose here, I actually want to create the status board. So I want to start thinking about what are all the different fields that I would want to create a spreadsheet with. So status, what side, the client name, the address, the sales price disclosure, maybe the disclosure dates, the escrow check dates, stuff like that. So you could create an entire list. And while I'm doing this, let me see here. Move that over here. I'm going to show you the actual board that I created here. So what I did was I just said, okay, I want to have the status, the side, the client name, maybe the address, sales price, and then some date fields for the disclosures, home. I just grabbed a few fields, and these may not be the ones that you would want to display, but definitely these are ones I just used as an example. You can use any date in there for whatever. And I'll make these available to you so you can kind of look at and modify and do how you want. I thought, well, maybe we also might want to know some party members that's involved, maybe the lender or the title that's doing that. It could be an attorney or, whatever. What is the closing date? You might want the closing time in there. I didn't put that in there, but again, something that you might want to think about. A note section, and then the MLS number. Now, the reason why I wanted the MLS number was one of the concepts here is I want to be able to update information. Maybe I don't have a certain date right now, but down the road through time, I figure out, hey, I have a certain date for my inspection. I have loan approval, these types of things. And I want to be able to update these fields as they go along through my closing process. So at the very beginning, whenever I first start this workflow, I may not know some of these dates. They may not have come to pass. There may not be in the contract yet, or just whatever. But I want to be able to update a row. So one of the things that we need to do is have some kind of unique ID, let's say. And in this case, I chose the MLS number. Now, I ran into a problem as I was thinking about this is, well, what if I have an MLS number, but what if I also am representing both the buyer and the seller? Well, it's going to have the same MLS number. So what I did was I said, okay, and I'm going to cover this in the steps as we go along, but I'm going to use for a unique identifier to identify the different rows. I'm going to use the MLS number. I'm also going to use the side. Am I representing the buyer or the seller? And I'm only going to have one buyer side with a certain MLS and one seller side with MLS, so it can be unique that way. I hope that is making sense. So it would be, buyer M14, 15, 19, 1, whatever, and then seller, it's unique. So I can find this particular row if I wanted to update this particular row just by saying, hey, find this side, find this MLS number. MLS number will always stay unique for the property. So this is what I came up with as an example. You guys can make them however you want, but some things to think about: what fields you wanting. We need some kind of unique row ID, and to do that, I chose to use the side and the MLS number. One thing that you do want to do, because we're using Zaps to do this, down here at the bottom where I have a status, this is going to be the board, and I'll show it to you here in a second, but this is where I actually want to display the information. This is just the raw data, so the Realvolve data. Make sure you name these what you want them to be named. If you click on the little down arrow and choose rename, name them what you want instead of sheet 1, sheet 2, sheet 3, whatever, because that can be very helpful whenever we're setting up the Zap. And I just wanted to make sure that you call it whatever you want it to do, because once you set up the Zap, you really can't change it, and it's better to set it up properly the first time. The other thing that you want to make sure of is making sure that the row 1 is the actual label of that column. So the status, the side, whatever. And I just colorize them. I did, and this is something I found out later, I did also colorize this first row as being, this red. One thing that you want to make sure of whenever you're first setting this up is on this freeze, don't freeze your first column until after you get everything set up. And the purpose of the freeze is if you get a lot of columns or rows of information, if you don't freeze this first column here, it'll scroll off the screen, and you can come up here to view, freeze row 1. And then as you scroll up and down, it will, I've only got eight or nine items here. Actually, here, let's do this just to show you the scroll. So here, with it frozen, you can see that row 1 stays on the top. If I view, freeze, no rows, then as I scroll up, that first row goes away. And I just prefer it to be shown, but you don't have to. But if you freeze it, Zapier has a problem with it. So don't freeze it until after you set up the Zap. Just a little note there. Okay, so the process that we need to do, once we've created the spreadsheet, then we need to go in there and we need to make a Zap. And I'm going to go into detail on this, but basically I'm actually creating a 4-step Zap. You could do it with less, but I'm going to show you why I chose 4 as well. The process in this case is we need some kind of trigger for the Zap to work. And that a trigger just basically says, okay, if I cause something to happen, I trigger something, I want something else to happen. In Zapier, you've got a trigger and you've got an action. So, and you can have multiple actions. You only have one trigger, typically. In this case, we're going to catch a hook. And basically all that means is data is coming in from that webhook URL that we talked about earlier. And then I'm going to do some things. So what I did, and I'll go into detail on this here real quick, but I created an action called utilities. And what I wanted to do was identify whenever I caught this data, I also wanted to catch some extra information, whether I was dealing with the buyer side or the seller side, and make sure that I update the client field with the right information. And I'll show you why and how I did that. I also did an action for find or create a row in Google Sheets. This basically says, whenever I send this data and I want to create a row, if it does not exist, great, but I need to find it if it does exist, I need that row number so I can update some values. And we're going to go through this process. Basically, we just need a lookup field. We need to search a direction, either top up or bottom down. Bottom up or top down. Said that backwards. And then check to see if the data doesn't exist, how you want to deal with it. And then we map all the fields. So let's go ahead and go through this process. It's not hard. It is just a process. So let's create a Zap. So we're going to go to Zapier.com, Zapier.com. And whenever you first come into Zapier and you log in, there'll be an option to create a Zap. So we're going to create the Zap. And then we choose Webhook. We type in Webhook, and you'll see there's a Webhook by Zapier right there. Whenever we click on that, then it says, okay, you're wanting to trigger based off of a webhook coming in. What kind of event do you want? Now, there's 3 different events for a webhook. We want the catch hook option, which basically just means whenever data comes in, whenever that URL is given, I want to catch whatever data is coming from that. I just want to use it somehow. So you choose catch hook and then click on continue. Zapier then says, okay, you want to catch a hook. I need to give you a URL. Now I've got part of this blurred out. I don't want you to see the whole thing on this one because it's my webhook. I don't want you to use it on yours or anything, but it'll give you a webhook URL, and we need to copy that. And the reason for webhooks is to collect data. Zapier says, okay, I'll give you this webhook. This is just something it gives us, and we need to copy it, and we're going to use it in Realvolve. Now, this is where Realvolve comes in play. So we're going to go into our activities, and I'm going to go ahead, just make this more live. I wanted to show this more in the case of this being a live example. I created 2 different pipeline updates, one for buyer and one for seller. And the reason why I did this is because whenever you look at this, I have a buyer side and I have a seller side of this that I want to track numbers and stuff with and make sure that the information's in there. But I didn't want to have to create, what if I handle both sides? So I wanted to be able to set up 2 different workflows, and I may be updating the spreadsheet differently for a seller than I am for a buyer. But in either case, I've got 2 different workflows. You can put this in an existing workflow. I created it as a separate workflow, but if you've already got a closing workflow for your buyer, then you could add something like this. Now, what I did was I said, okay, update number 1 for the seller. This is just my seller workflow. I want to update the spreadsheet with some seller information. In which case, you can assign who's supposed to do it, when am I supposed to do this? I just said 0 days after start date just to make it easy. And what I wanted to do is before I sent this status, because I might have an assistant that's doing this for me that may not know what Realvolve, all the fields and stuff in Realvolve, and may not know the process. Again, whenever you're setting up workflows, it's all about making sure you've got some process set up. And if you've got the fields that you want to make sure get set up in a checklist, then they'll display in a list, and then you can fill in the fields, make sure they're set up. And I'm going to show an example of this here in just a second. So I said, okay, I want to make sure that I've got the transaction type. I've got the seller name in there, selected the seller, make sure I have my street address, my city. Do I have my sales price in there? Who's my loan officer? Who's my title? What's the closing date and the MLS number? These are just checklist items that will pop up before it actually tries to send any kind of update. Then in my action, click on this. In the past, prior to our update, we only had 3 types of actions. We could send a message, we can update tags, or we can stop workflows. We now have this workflow or webhook option where we can update data to this website. In this case, I'm just saying that my title of my action is update the spreadsheet. Self-explanatory. But to do that, I'm using a webhook URL that I had gotten from Zapier. So whenever we went to that first step in Zapier, we copied that URL. We're actually just pasting that URL into this webhook URL field. And at that point, technically, you can click on Send Sample Data. And if it will then give you, it basically just dumps a bunch of data in there. I am aware of an issue with Zapier that they don't display all the fields if you've got a lot of fields. And we do send a lot of fields with the Send Sample Data. So if there's a field that doesn't show up, you know it's in there, it's just not showing, then you might need to actually run this action on an actual workflow activity for an actual property to actually get the fields that you want. Hoping that made sense, but the send sample data should be fine for you in most cases. Then you just click on save. So the fields, like I said, are just extra verification fields that I wanted in my checklist. But then I also wanted to add some webhook stuff. Now, one of the things that I had told you was that in this, I was using the side, whether I'm the buyer side or the seller side, and also the MLS key to identify things. And there are times whenever I'm running a workflow on a property, that property might have me listed as both the buyer side and the seller side agent, right? So I'm handling both sides. So what I wanted to do, and this is a new concept that I wanted to show today because it can be useful in lots of different options. So normally the webhook that you're sending is just a big long string of numbers, okay? This is a URL. In my case, in this particular thing, I wanted to use the same Zap for a buyer and also for a seller. But if I set this up for the buyer and I brought over buyer information and thrown it into the contact side, then I would have just buyers in here. And that's not what I wanted. If I want sellers, if I'm doing the seller side, I want to also have the seller in there. Now, I could have very easily said, well, there's a buyer column and a seller column, and then filled in the appropriate one. That would be the other option. But I still have an issue with, in my Realvolve data, you go here to this one, where transaction type, if I say selling and buying side, I'm handling both sides. Then if I start a workflow for my seller, I can't really use this necessarily for both buying and selling because I just want to update one row on here. So here's how I solve this. I said, okay, the normal parameter, the normal webhook URL is this big long string of things. I'm going to add an extra parameter on there. I'm going to add with a little question mark. I'm going to say, okay, for my workflows that I'm dealing with the buyer, I want to put side equals buyer as a parameter. For the workflows that I'm dealing with the seller side, I want to put a question mark, side equals seller. And just a little note on parameters. I'm not using additional ones in this case, but if you wanted to send multiple parameters, now, and this is just extra data that's not part of the database fields. Now, technically I do have these as database fields, but because this one here is both buying and selling, I can't really use it to divide it out. I need to know the workflow, is it for the buyer, or the workflow, is it for the seller? So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm just saying $side equals seller or $buyer. If I needed additional items, like a parameter 2 or parameter 3, and it contains whatever, blah in this case, I would use ampersands for anything after that. So the question mark is always right after the URL, and the parameter, the ampersand, is any additional parameters after the first one. Just a little notation there. I'm not using these, but I want to make sure that you guys knew it. That way you can pass extra information. That could be useful, like if you're sending out postcards and you want to use the same workflow to send out postcards, but you want to be able to send different types of postcards. Maybe postcard number 123 versus 456. You could actually do additional parameters. But in this case, all I'm doing is sending out this long string of stuff with either buyer or seller. So whenever I do that, I go back to my Zap and I say, okay, I want to test my trigger after I've gone through the process of copying the URL and clicking on continue. It takes me to this test window. And if I had pressed the send sample data on this, it will send sample data and it will show you that sample data that's in here, which is real cool. So I can see all the different sample data that might be in there. And then what we're looking for at this point is just that, hey, we found the data, here's the information, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so from this point forward, I'm actually going to just switch over here, and because this really takes a little bit more detail. So that what we were just going through was this catch hooks, the trigger side of a Zap, all the way to the testing. So we got a successful test. So then what you can do is you can click on the little plus to add additional actions. And in those actions, this one, I actually said, I want to do an action that divides out and grabs some extra information, whether I'm dealing with the buyer or the seller. Okay. In this case, I'm using this Formatter by Zapier. Formatter is a special option where you can have different formats of data. You might bring in the word test and you want to capitalize the T in test, or you want to make sure it's all lowercase. There's some text options to do that. There's some number options to do different things. There's a section called utilities, which is what I'm using here. And in utilities, there's a lookup option. In the lookup option, I'm saying, okay, the query string that I sent that information on, where I put in the question marks, side equals buyer or side equals seller, I'm looking for that query string. Hey, Nicole, can I have you mute for a second?
Sorry.
No, you're good. Been there, done that many times. All my kids are grown up now, but it's fun. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, if I'm passing that question mark side, it's a query string is what's called. In this case, it's called side because I named it side, question mark equals, or the question mark side equals buyer, question mark side equals seller. If it's buyer, I want to have this data look up the buyer last name. If it's seller, I want it to look up the seller last name. And all this step does is helps me fill out this column with either the buyer name or the seller name based off of the side being either buyer or seller. That's all it's doing. There is a fallback value. If for some reason you don't have buyer or seller in there, or it's missing, then it'll just come back and say unknown. So I'm going to close this. So this piece here, I'm doing it to make it a little bit more advanced so I can just have one column to track my client name. You could have two different columns, one for buyer, one for seller, and it would be fine without it. But I just wanted to have one column. Then the next action, and this was really probably the most important action, is we need to find the row that we want, if it exists. If it doesn't exist, we want to create it. So we're using the Google Sheets app. Every Zap has different apps. In this case, I'm using the Google Sheets app. And I'm saying I want to look up a spreadsheet row as my action for this event. So we'll do that. And then it does say, hey, which account do I want to use? I'm using my Mark at Realvolve account. And then this is where the setup happens. And this is the cool part. So I'm going to be swapping back and forth between these, but in this case, you'll see that I'm using the team pipeline spreadsheet, the Google spreadsheet team pipeline. So I came up here and I said, okay, I want to use the team pipeline spreadsheet. And in that spreadsheet, there is a certain worksheet, and the worksheets are these items that's down at the bottom. I want to use this Realvolve data worksheet. And then it's going to say, okay, I'm going to look up a column, and we talked about this earlier. I'm going to look up a column, in this case, my MLS number. MLS number is the column I want to use, and I want to pull data from my webhook that's up here in step 1. I want to pull data from the transaction MLS number. Now, these are all the different fields. If I was to look in here, catch hook, these are all the different fields of all the different data that can come across. Lots and lots of stuff. You can go in there and just do a search. But basically, I did a search for transaction MLS number because I wanted to find that. Now, remember, I said the MLS number may not be unique because I also am dealing with the seller side and the buyer side. So I could have two different rows. So I need to also, in addition to looking for the MLS number, I need to do a supporting lookup that says, okay, I also want to look into that query string. Am I dealing with the buyer side or the seller side? The query string was that question mark piece that I added. And that was from the step 1 hook, show all fields. If I scroll all the way down here to the bottom, actually, let's do it this way. It doesn't do it very well that way. Do a search for side. Actually, there's all kinds of side. Query. Oh, here's that query string side buyer. So the data that I sent was dealing with the buyer at the time instead of the seller on this one. So if it has information, great. The bottom up option here, I set this to true. I don't know that it really matters bottom up or top down, but basically it's looking from the bottom up to find the first one that matches. If you're adding from the bottom or adding to the bottom of this, every time you append, it adds it to the bottom. If there just happen to be the same MLS number, it would get the newest one, is basically the premise there, the thought there of doing bottom up. So at this point, if I find my MLS number, and if I don't find my MLS number, or I don't find the side with that MLS number, because both have to be true, it has to find both of them exactly, then I want to create a Google Sheet row if it doesn't exist. So I'm going to start putting in then all my fields of data from that webhook. I put in my status, my side. This is actually the query string that I passed in, whether it's the buy side or the sell side. But the rest of these are all fields in the database. The transaction status, the client. So this one is different. This one is the one where I said, okay, I want to make sure if it's the buyer, I want the client from the buyer side. If it's the seller, I want the seller. Because we have two different fields in Realvolve, I used this utility to decide. So basically it's saying, okay, use that utility output and choose, was it the buyer's name or the seller's name that I'm using for the client field? So that's the magic that allows me to use one field. It's actually looking at the side and grabbing the output from that utility action. The rest of these now are all fields just from the URL data that we're sending through that webhook. So the street address, the sales price, the disclosure received, the earnest due date, home inspection, approval, the lender mailing name, the title mailing name, and then the closing date. So these are all different things. And I did not use the notes field. I wanted to use this as a place where if they just wanted to add some additional notes to the spreadsheet, they could. So I really didn't use that field for anything after all, but I did have to make sure that I filled in the MLS number. So this is all basically saying if you find the row, return that row. If you didn't find the row, create the data in it. Okay. So then, and you can test that action. It'll go in successful. The one thing that you want to look at here, and this is the reason why it's so important to identify all your stuff ahead of time. If for some reason I wanted to add an additional column in here, the way Zapier is set up is it uses columns A through Z or however many there are. And if you've got it set up A through Z, if you add in a column, it can throw all these off. So you would have to go back in and reselect them. And that's a real pain in the butt. So make sure that you add in all your columns that you want. If there's any new columns that you want to add them to the end. You could add other items to the end of the list, but don't put them in the middle here. Okay, then I can test and continue. So then the last step of this is actually saying, okay, if I did find the record and it didn't create it, if I do find it, then I want to update the data that's in that spreadsheet. So same type of thing. It's a Google Sheet. It's update row, the update spreadsheet row in this case. I still choose my same account. In this case, the same basic information. It's the team pipeline. It's the workflow piece. The thing that's important here is which row am I updating? So what this is this is saying, okay, if I did find something in step 3, what's its ID? And the thing about this particular action is that it does return back the ID of the row. So in this case, it actually found my data in row 6 of that spreadsheet. So that row's there and says, okay, based off of finding it, here's all the things that I want to update. And it's all the same fields that I did before, query string, the outputs, all the same fields that I did in that previous. It's kind of, it's duplicating everything. It's kind of a pain the way Zapier has it set up. It'd really be nice if it just said update or add instead of just find. But in either case, that's the way they're set up. And so every column has a value and it goes in. So once you have all that set up, you turn it on. This is kind of the end result. So let me actually exit out of that and get rid of this piece for a second. And what I want to do now is I want to say, okay, I want to fill this information out. And let me pull over Realvolve over here. And let me go over to a property. So here's a property, 111 Main Avenue. And let's say, actually, this is an old one, but I still want to update it. I want to go through the process of doing this. Normally, you do this on a brand new one, but I'm going to start a workflow. Before I do this, though, I want to see, okay, in this case, I'm actually handling both the selling and the buying side. So this might be a good example where I'm doing both the buying and the selling. I've got an MLS number of 123456, just some sample data in here. So I'm going to start a workflow, and I'm going to show how this is done. So for my seller side, maybe I've started some seller side workflow of something, and it's got some of these activities in it, or I've just created a single workflow with just my update stuff and run it separately. You can do it either way. In this case, it has 4 different activities dealing with the updating the seller information, the pipeline status information, some dates and stuff. I'm just going to leave everything as is. Okay, and hit done. So I started workflow number 1 for the seller side. And if I just refresh this, you'll see here's all the activities. Now they're all past due because it's all old dates in this sample, but there's this one activity here that was for the start date. I'm going to go ahead and do it. Actually, let me, just so I can, you guys can see it better on this side. I'm going to complete this activity. So here's where all those checklist items came into play. Whenever I said we were setting up the checklists, all these individual checklist items here, they show up as fields in the activity, which is cool because if my assistant is doing this, and maybe I've got a brand new assistant, they don't know where all the field information is, they just need to fill in the values, I can fill in values, right? I've got my transaction type. If it wasn't selected, I could select it right here. It is selected. Do I have my seller? Sam Smith is my seller. Great. I've got them in there. I've got my street address. That's great. The city. I actually don't use the city in my zip or in my spreadsheet. I still have it in there. I can take that out. But do I have my price? Yes, I do. Oh, but I don't have my loan officer. So let's come over here and let's say we're going to use Larry Linder. Larry Linder. Got him selected. And then for title, we use Terry Title. Use some easy to remember names in there. Do I have my closing date? In this case, it was May of last year. And then my MLS number. So yes, I've filled in all the values because I've completed all my checklist items. Now my activity, the action itself is able to play because I'm, anytime that you have checklist items, if you don't say that it's for an incomplete checklist, they're only available if everything in the checklist is checked. So I've checked off all my items. Now it says, hey, great news, you can run this update spreadsheet. So I'm going to just check on that and click on run. Now, whenever I do that, what you'll see is that it'll add a new item to this list because I don't have this address in this list at all. If I come up here, 111 North Main, it's not in this list at all, right? So I'm going to come over here and say run. So whenever I do that, boom, it adds it in. It said, hey, here's the status is closed. We're running the seller side. So it put that in there. Because it was running the seller side, it looked in the people tab of this and it said, give me the seller's name. And I'm just putting in the last name in this case, the address, the price, some of the information. Now, I started off putting in just month and day. In this case, I'm putting in the whole thing. And then home warranties. Let's see. Actually, it didn't do Terry title. That's interesting. Maybe it didn't update. Here's the other cool thing, though. Let me come back over here to actions. Completed. I'm going to run that again. I'm just going to run it a second time. And see if it, yeah, there we go. It updated the Larry Lender and the Terry title. So the cool thing is anytime, if you've got other spreadsheets that you use for other things, you can now have, through an action on an activity in a workflow, be able to automatically update the information for you. So here's some basic information for that. Okay, so then I come in here and I say, okay, maybe I completed my inspection. I want to make sure it's updated. Home inspection date, run the update. And, oh, actually, we already did that one. And home warranty. The home warranty. Oh, we don't have a home warranty filled in yet. Let's say that was on, of course, everything's old. I'm just going to put it today's date and say we update that. And it updates. The whole key to this, and there's the home update or the home warranty. So the key to this is setting up the automations so that at any point in time within your workflow, you can update values in a spreadsheet, you can do it, not just spreadsheets, but Trello boards or whatever. We've had some people say, well, we'd like to be able to set up a list of things to do, before, done, and past due or whatever. In Trello boards, you could do that. But this is just a way to update a spreadsheet that just makes it really simple once it's set up. And granted, it takes a little bit of time to set up. Now, if I was just to look at this, it's kind of ugly. It's whatever. But what you can do is say, well, I want to create a spreadsheet, a status board that looks a little bit better, and maybe I want to display that up on a TV. So maybe I don't want to show my formula boards, and maybe I just want to view this in full screen. And actually just maximize this. So now, at any time, if I wanted to, so here, I'm going to, from my other screen, I've got multiple screens that I'm running. I'm going to start, so here's my status board of things going on. And I do have it set up in, here's that row that I just added for Smith from last year. Let me go ahead and start the workflow for the buyer side pipeline. So maybe this screen is up on your monitor and things are happening within your business. All these awesome listings are getting sold. And at some point during the process, more updates happen, in which case I'm going to complete this. what I'm doing is on the other screen here, I was just making sure everything is all filled in. I've got John O'Beyer here. Everything else is good. And I'm going to run the update. So get that out of the way. And then you'll see here in a second, boom, there's just happened with adding this. Now, what I did here was I set up a formula in this first cell here that says, show me these columns in this particular order and show them to me in reverse closing date. So it's actually ordered by this closing date. So the most recent closing date is at the top, and as they go on, so all your old data would go down to the bottom. Any questions? And there could be lots of questions on that. I know I hit you with a lot of stuff. Since we are recording this, you can go back and rewatch anything that you want. But I know we've got users that use lots of different spreadsheets for doing different things. The important thing to understand is now with the webhook, you can actually use your webhook action to update your spreadsheets on the fly. So you don't have to spend that extra, 3-5 minutes of pulling up the spreadsheet, finding the information, typing in the information. It can do it for you automatically. How cool is that? Any questions? I know one of the things that we did there for a while is we used Clipfolio as another utility. It was some kind of monthly service on it where you can make pretty different types of pretty update status boards and stuff and show up on your screen. We actually use that here at Realvolve, and that was really cool. You could do the exact type of thing here. Let's see. Here's a question. Cody, I have an idea that I've been working on. I think you could make this look way better. Display it. Let's talk soon. Okay. Can do, Cody. But yeah, you can create, if I wanted some charts or graphs on here, certainly create some charts and graphs. Being able to, maybe you've got some goals for your team to hit a certain goal, and based off of the number of listings and show the status board of goals that you want. You can do all kinds of stuff now with that ability to bring that data over. And again, I mean, I'm just going to hit it real quick. The office hours. So come back up here. You make the spreadsheet, you make the webhooks app, and you build the action. Once you do those 3 things right there, you've got everything in there, and it takes some time to set that up. It may take you 2 hours. I don't know. It took me a little bit less just because I knew what I was doing. But the thing really is to make sure that you think through what it is that you want to put in your spreadsheet. And if you've got that, that's half the battle. That's making sure you've got everything in there. The only other thing you got to make sure of is that you've got some kind of unique key to update the information. If you're updating. Now, you could be, maybe another option would be, hey, at the end, whenever I close, I just want to send my commission information to a spreadsheet. That's all I want to do. In that case, you wouldn't need to do the find option. All you want to do is update a row. You're just blasting it in there. And at the end, you can go in there. And then if you need to make any alterations or changes afterwards, you could just do it manually if you wanted to. But this particular example, I wanted it to, every time something happened, I wanted to update the status board. So we needed to be able to do that key. Any questions? Any questions about anything other than this? If there's no questions about updating the spreadsheet with Zaps, I can certainly go to other options as well. Well, you're a tough crowd this time. Nobody's talking. Either I blew you away and you're so lost, or I was very thorough. I'm hoping I was very thorough. I'm always cautious. I know this is kind of a big topic and a big piece, but I think once you understand it, it can be very, very useful in what you do. Setting up that action, you're just creating the action. You can skip all these other options. It's just adding that webhook piece. I added the checklist just because I wanted to make sure everything that I wanted in that spreadsheet to be filled in. I created that for that purpose. And then the big idea on this particular training was making sure that you understood the extra parameters. So, because those are what we used for identifying the seller name or the buyer name and the separate rows. All right, guys. Well, if you have any additional questions, I'll post this on our Facebook page and actually the community page. And if you have any questions, you can post them there. And if you, I'll also link the screens here that I've got in this slideshow and make those available as well. So everybody have a great rest of your week. If I don't see you between now and then, I'll see you next week. Have an awesome day. Bye.